Hey, what's happening, guys? It's Dean from Electronisounds. Stick around. Today we're going to talk about Beatmaker 3, we're going to talk about live jams, we're going to talk about limitations, and we're going to talk about scenes mode. Stick around, guys.
Electronisounds Audio, the YouTube channel for you.
Okay, let's talk about the setup first and foremost, guys. This is an iPad Air 2 that I'm using with Beatmaker 3. We are running into an audio interface. Today we're using the Novation Audio Hub 2x4. You can use any audio interface with your iPad that you like. And if you're not familiar with connecting your iPad to an audio interface, I have a video on that. I'll put a link up in the corner here. Today we're also using the MIDI controller, Novation Launch Control XL, and this is assigned to the macros and to the pads inside of Beatmaker 3, and I'm going to show you how I set that up. We've got this plugged directly into the audio hub 2x4. If you're using a different audio interface that does not have a USB hub built into it, you'll just plug this into the USB hub that your devices are plugged into. I've got audio coming out of the audio hub there, just going into my main mixer. I'm gonna get all hardwired in onto a microphone today, onto a lavalier microphone rather, so that we can get super clean sound, and I'll plug in direct sound to the iPhone 8 Plus, which is what we're filming with. One last thing, and that's I'm using, let's see if I can, excuse my back there, I'm using this Anchor USB battery to get power to the iPad. We're using the under here, we're using the USB to Lightning connection adapter, USB to Lightning 3 from Apple brand adapter, excuse me. And I'm using this, super long USB to Lightning cable so that we can, get the battery out of the shot or whatever. The reason why I use the battery instead of wall power a lot of the time with the iPads is that will prevent any sort of like a ground loop or AC hum in the system. And these batteries are pretty big and pretty solid, and they last, for if you're got it charged up and whatnot, you can pretty much, work a full day with a setup like this and not worry about, losing power to the iPad. Okay, we're going to go ahead and switch over to direct sound, and I'm going to show you guys how I got this all set up inside of Beatmaker 3. Stick around. Okay, guys, it's pretty difficult for me to know where to start because this is a pretty big project. But I think what we're going to do off the jump is we're going to start with limitations and how I'm using Beatmaker 3 within its own limitations. And what that means for me is I'm using Beatmaker 3 in what I'm referring to as a one-bank workflow. And that means if we go into our, song mode here, we'll see that I only literally have bank A1, and that's it. There are no additional tracks. I'm not using, a bank for each sound. I am loading samples onto individual pads inside of one bank inside of Beatmaker 3. And we're programming out sequences, and then we're assigning those, patterns rather, to the scenes inside of Beatmaker 3. Now you can do this with more than one bank. You do not have to use a one bank workflow, but the reason why I do this is so that when I assign my macros and my faders and my buttons here with the controller to Beatmaker 3, I want them always to be exactly what I've assigned. I don't want to have to switch back and forth between the banks in Beatmaker 3 to know where my macros are. If I want to tweak a bass line, I just want to reach to a knob and I want to tweak that bass line. I don't want to have to remember, oh, the bass is on, bank 4 per se, and then I can tweak the bass line. And now I want to affect the drums, so I would have to click a nut and switch back to the drum bank, and that sort of a workflow does not work for me. And so until we have something like a global MIDI learn or something in Beatmaker 3 that allows you to assign, your knobs and faders to any knob or fader inside of here, until we have something like that, this has been my workaround. Because in a one bank workflow, I can still process the samples any way I want. I can assign, effects to every single pad. I can send any pad I want to the global effect sends. And I have my macro set up here. I have 16 macros that I'm using. I'm actually only using 15 of those, and we're going to get into that, how I've set those up in just a moment. But before we do that, let's talk about how I've mapped the controller inside of Beatmaker 3. If you go ahead and click on the little three lines icon. Some people call it the sandwich icon. I call it sort of the options icon. I don't know. And that's going to give you a gear icon, which is going to allow you to get into your focus actions editor. And this is where we're going to assign whatever MIDI controller you've got connected to Beatmaker 3. It could be anything, that has a combination of, buttons or pads, sliders, and knobs. I really like the Novation Launch Control XL. It actually has, a more robust amount of knobs than we can assign inside of Beatmaker 3. But what I do is I'm assigning these 16 pads down here at the bottom to the trigger pads inside of Beatmaker 3, so that I've got this, connected up to Beatmaker 3 via USB here, and I'll just, touch trigger pad 1, and it'll start flashing and wait for me to assign, a button on my MIDI controller, and I'll repeat that for all 16 trigger pads, okay, and I've got all my pads assigned that way. Another thing that I did is I scroll down here, and at the very bottom, you can assign the play and the stop buttons and the record buttons. I like to assign those to some, buttons on my controller, so as I'm working, I can kind of, sorry about the volume jump there. I can kind of just anytime I want to start and stop the Beatmaker from going using just the controller. My goal here was to get this set up so that I could do the jam without having to touch the iPad at all, which I was able to achieve here. So if we scroll back up just a little bit, we can get to the macro control assignments, and then I would just click a macro control, and I would just turn whichever knob I want to assign to that. And this is an important trick, and this is how I did this jam. So listen up, guys. What I did to use these faders, because you can't assign, the faders, you can't assign these faders to Beatmaker 3's mixer. There's no way to do that. But I was able to use these in the jam, and here's how I did it. I assigned macros 1 through 8 to these knobs here, to these 8 knobs. And I assigned macros 9 through 16 to these faders, okay? And then using a one-bank workflow, when I want to assign a sound to a fader, we just assign that sound. So this is, become macro number 9. This has become macro number 10, 11, 12. You get the drift. So when I'm, I labeled my tracks here inside of Beatmaker 3 as to, what's controlling what. I'm not afraid of putting a line of tape and, getting out the Sharpie. I know some people a little embarrassed about that, but I don't care. Whatever gets it, done, So I've got like a kick drum. I've got the kick drum on, channel 1. I've got the tom sort of bass line going through channel 2. I've got my hats on 3. I've got a clap on 4. I've got another tom on 5. I've got the ride on 6, bass on 7, and the chord stabs and melodics on 8. So at any time during this jam, I have control over the volumes of these sounds, which is a total workaround inside of Beatmaker 3, and you can only get this set up using my one bank workflow workaround, and that's important to keep in mind. You can't actually assign these to the main mixer inside of Beatmaker 3, which is why I developed this workaround. Okay, so we've got our controller connected to Beatmaker 3, right? And if we're not in scenes mode or anything, by default, these 16 pads down here will correspond to the 16 pads that are on the screen. So I've got some sounds here. I'm going to go ahead and switch clips, and we'll discuss all of the sounds that I'm using individually and how I created the sound scheme for this. Hang on one sec. Okay, so this is actually pretty easy to go through, guys, because we're on a one-bank workflow. And what I did was I just started assigning sounds to the individual pads here, and all of these sounds, for the most part, I recorded in from outside gear in the studio. These kick drums. Here, this is like a straight kick drum. This one has kind of a little rhythm on it. And that one's just a little bit of a faded out version of this one, so it's a little bit smoother. So I have 3 versions of a kick drum here. I sampled these in from the Digitact. I have a shaker that I sampled in from my MC303. The clap here that I sampled in from the MC303. You're going to hear some effects on some of these sounds. They're not baked into the sample. We're actually using the global effects inside of Beatmaker 3, and I'll get to that in a different clip. So here's our clap from the MC303. There's another clap. There's a different version of how I set those claps up. Maybe the pannings are different. It's a hi-hat sample. Here's the actual bass line as a loop. It's kind of a bass line that I made out of a tom sample, and I made this with the Electron Digitact using the sounds in my expansion banks that I've just released. This is actually part of that bass line, and this kick drum are actually part of some of the audio demos for those banks, but I really dig that groove. So that's what I sampled in here to create this groove from. Here we have another bass sound. This is a bass, just a one shot that I sampled out of the Virus Dark Star over here. This was probably sampled through like the Electron Analog Heat to give it a little bit more saturation and character. Here's a high pass version of our bass line. If you can't hear the difference, put on a pair of headphones. That's something else to keep in mind with my workflow as well, by just, using a sample-based workflow. If I need a variation of a sound, I don't have to worry about doing automation inside of the app or anything like that. I can literally just copy it to a different pad and say, put a filter on this version of it to use in certain sections of the track. I think that's a definite benefit to a sample-based workflow. You just keep filling up the pads with the variations you need, and it, really saves you some time and headache from not having to worry about, programming automation and whatnot. Different version of the hat so that I can kind of go, don't get it, you know what I mean, to get the rhythm there. Yet another version of the, tom bass that I needed for, some variation there. There's our hard tom, and these are two different pads because one's going to be panned a little bit one way. This is pan 10 to the right, and that one's pan 10 to the left. That's another trick that I like to use a lot. I'll double up the same sound on different pads, maybe do one a little bit more lower volume, or a little slightly different tuning than the other one. In this case, slightly different panning to help with our stereo image. This is a high pass kick drum that I've run through a lot of effect. We're going to go up to the next page here. Now I've got some chords running through a lot of delay and reverb. I love the delay and the reverb. There's a variation of that chord. So we have this one here where the filter is all the way open, and on this one here I have a low pass filter that's closed down a little bit for variation. And then on the third pad here I have a band pass chord. The cool thing about this is I've run a band pass filter, okay, inside of Beatmaker 3 on the chord, okay, so it's a band pass filter, and then I've clicked the cutoff button, and I've told Beatmaker 3 to modulate this cutoff, right? I've told it to modulate that cutoff with an LFO, and I assigned LFO 1 to modulate this cutoff. Now, hear how the sound changes even though I'm just hitting the same pad? That's the LFO moving this filter up and down. If I click over to the modulations tab, we can see here that we have an LFO 1. It's set to a 1-bar sync, and it's set to about 43% amount to affect. And you can, here we're getting a bit of movement on that. And when we assign something like this to reverb and delay, and we're moving it, you get a lot of really nice, just that movement in the mix. Here we have a couple of stabs that I sampled out of the Virus Dark Star through quite a bit of saturation to really get them jumping out of the mix and on top of the other sounds. And so what I did was I just, to get my pattern, just did a little bit of programming automation. I mean, not automation, but you know what I mean. Programmed in little notes, and then when I want it to hold, I programmed the note to hold. Here's a ride sound that I sampled out of the MC303. It's a crash cymbal. It's kind of my go-to crash that I sampled from an actual Zildjian crash cymbal way back in the day, my old studio. The noise burst impact sound that I use, to layer with the crash sometimes to get more of impact on a downbeat. This is a riser that I made, and my mic is scratching on my shirt there, sorry. This is a pumping riser that I made inside of Ableton Live and just imported in. Here's a couple of ride samples. I do a little bit of panning on these. So I've got like a left and a right. Little bit adjusting on the fine tune, it sounds like there as well. Yeah, like the fine tune is just literally 1, cent off of the default. And you can hear that just ever so slightly. The devil's in the details, you know what I mean? This particular jam is in the key of G sharp. Here's a bass drop that I made that's in the, sort of starts on a G sharp and bends that note down. It's one of my go-to down filter sounds that I use, to get a big dramatic impact on certain sections and help with the momentum of the track, And then last but not least, we have some nice chord stabs that I sampled out of the Virus as well. Some really smooth, kind of late night techno, deep housey, chilled. And that's it, guys. Those are all of the sounds that I'm using to construct this track. And I either recorded them in, through my audio interface here with using the gear that I've got in the studio, or a few of these are some go-to sounds that I made inside of Ableton Live, like that down filter, and that noise burst, and this pumping riser as well, which has the pump built into it. And if you guys have been listening to my music for any period of time at all, you know that those are, really common elements to the, music that I produce. So let's go ahead and move on, guys, and I'll talk about how I actually programmed these out and assigned the sounds to the scenes and whatnot, so that we can change it up and actually do the jamming. Hey guys, making these videos really takes a lot of work and time. If you'd like to support me, please consider buying some of my sample packs over at Electronisounds.com, or maybe become a patron over at Patreon.com. You can sign up for as little as $1 a month, and you get access to all sorts of bonus downloads, as well as behind-the-scenes content. Thanks for watching, guys. Okay, so let's see here. If I go back down to page 1 and we go into what would normally be like our song mode, right? There's a button right next to that that says scenes. And what you do is it's going to start with 1 or 2 scenes, and there'll be a plus button for you to, add more scenes, or you can, hold on those and you can delete those scenes if you don't need them. What I have here is I have 16 scenes. And the reason for that is that when you want to live jam with scenes, right, you'll have set your scenes up in advance, and you'll go to any, of the pad's main bank, and you'll press the scene button. And now, when you press any of these buttons, it will launch that scene at the start of the next bar. You can change, how it launches here. I find, bar to, be the way to go to make the most sense. And how that works is, I'll launch a scene. I can do some tweaking using the macros that I've assigned over here. And when I'm ready to move on, I can press any of these, buttons on the controller that are assigned to these 16 pads, and it will launch that next scene on the downbeat. Let me give you an example of what I mean here, and then we'll go in and show you how I created these. So now if I press 1, it's going to launch the scene that I have assigned to scene 1. I'm a big fan of labeling everything, so I have my scenes all labeled. We have an intro 1 scene, intro 2, add ride, add clap plus, so adding a clap plus more stuff. We have a funky chords scene, add a lead stab, chilled chords, tom action, and big jam. Now over here in the upper right, I have one that's called turnaround, and that I can use as like a 1-bar roll between any of these scenes, and I'll explain that in just a moment. So here, if I press the actual, trigger button, it launches this scene here because we're in scene mode. And anytime I press another trigger, it will launch that scene assigned to that pad on the very next downbeat of the next bar. So I can do that at any time. You don't have to wait for a scene to play out all the way. You don't have to wait for a full 8 bars. Let me show you what I mean. 2, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 3, 4, and 4. Let's change it right now. And we're going to another scene. 2, 2, 3, and here we go. anytime I click one of these buttons, it's going to launch the scene assigned to that button on the next downbeat. This is how you can do the live jamming, and like depending on where you're at, you'll decide, what scene to launch next, and you can really customize the way that your groove is going and the way that your groove is flowing. This is where it really, comes into play what you've got assigned to your macros and how you set up your macros inside of Beatmaker 3. We're going to get to that in just a minute, but first, let me show you how I actually, program the individual sounds out. I'm just using, I go into our, scenes mode here, or you could be in song mode, it doesn't matter, and like, we're gonna, like, if we want to affect that, if we want to program per se, like the scene that's here, I can just click over to pattern, and I don't know if you can see here, but I have, because this is a one bank workflow, all of my sounds that are on those pads are just labeled here. And, here we have our grid, and it's pretty straightforward. You can see, like if I want to do a kick, it's on, pad 1, kick 2. I mean, it's all labeled, only if you're labeling your stuff. I highly recommend you be labeling your stuff. And so you just use the touch interface here. You can change the grid size over here by just, you can have a 1/16 grid. I like to use a 1-bar grid when I'm putting in like long notes, or a quarter note grid if I'm putting in long notes, or if I'm getting into the detailed work, I'll often work in the, 16th grid. So let me show you what I mean by that. If we click over to 16th, right, and then I just zoom in, here we can see, like, I've done intricate programming on our hi-hat sound. You can even see that there's some differences in the way the notes are represented here, and that's because there's different velocities on these sounds. So for instance, like if I go into the pattern MIDI, you can affect the note velocity of these sounds and get as intricate inside of this sort of thing as you want. You can see that on this scene here, it just, I've got 8 bars of, MIDI notes programmed out for every scene. Some of the scenes are a lot more complicated than others. And what we can do is, if we go back to scenes mode, we can, like, let's say we want to, check out one of those more complicated scenes. I can go to like the add lead stab scene. I can go over to pattern here. We can actually just make sure that that one's highlighted, and it is there. Okay, cool. And you can see, if I start moving, and you'll just, this is something that you'll just get used to if you're working this way. The zoom and the, how you can look at your notes, you'll definitely be doing, a lot. I found this really easy though. I mean, come on, you guys. I mean, this is amazing. You can just get in and zoom in and get as detailed as you need, to get, all within inside one bank inside of Beatmaker 3. I will say that I'm pushing the air tube here right at its capacity with what I'm creating here. And if you listen back to the jam itself, you'll hear some crackles in the audio throughout, actually. And that's because I'm literally pushing this iPad a little bit harder than I should be pushing it, and I had to kind of hold back on adding more stuff and whatnot. One of the ways that you can work within those limitations and combat that is if you go back to the options and you go back to the gear and you go over to your audio and MIDI devices tab, the tab in the middle. You can adjust your audio settings here, and most importantly, you can adjust your latency. The lower your latency, the more the lower latency you'll have, meaning the more immediate response time. You tap that and it's like boom, 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 boom. Whereas if you have a higher latency, maybe up to 1024 samples, your immediate response time is on the on the unit is a little bit slowed down. And I like to keep it as high as possible, but that's not always an option. So in this jam, I've got the latency set to 512 samples, which I found was a pretty good middle ground between the latency and the amount of crackles that I was getting. If I turned it up to like 1024 samples, it's hard to get it to like respond like in time when you're actually moving the pads in time. So I found 512 samples on the latency to be a good workaround there. Sorry, the mic just keeps scratching on my shirt, guys. And so basically, I've got, my patterns here, and as I want to work on them, I can just, change the patterns. You know, it says add ride pattern. Here's my big jam pattern, and I can zoom in on them as needed and, you know, put the dots in as needed, move them around, change the velocities and whatnot. Sometimes as you're playing and adjusting the patterns, back over here in scenes mode, things might get a little bit screwy, which is why I find it, again, really important to label everything. This is my add lead stab scene, but for some reason, you know, I've been messing around in here, and now the big jam scene is assigned there instead. And this is an easy fix if you're labeling stuff. You label your patterns over here, you know, by pressing the 3 dots and choosing rename. You know, you'll give everything a name, and then when you're creating the scenes, you'll hold the button there and you'll click, you know, rename, and you'll give the scene a name as well. That way, when you're in scene mode, those names show up on the pads. You know, the name intro. You could, you know, have one called chorus or bridge or turnaround or, you know, outro, etc., etc. And so we'll go back into our scenes mode here, and you just want to make sure that everything is, you know, as it should be, that that they match up. Add clap, funky chords, and here you can see, the add lead stab has the big jam in it instead. So if you click that, then you go over here, you just change that add lead stab, and then you can just, you know, go through. There's no scenes in those ones. My turnaround, and we're back, you know, back to good there. So again, in regular mode, you've just got your pads, you know, and you've got your sounds laid out across the pads here. And then in scenes mode, you're actually launching those scenes. And you can do that by touching, you know, on the, you know, iPad itself. If you don't have a controller, you don't need to have a controller. You can certainly, you know, adjust the macros on the screen inside of Beatmaker 3. You don't need to use, you know, knobs. Let's go ahead and switch to a different clip, and I'm going to explain a little bit about how I set up these macros and how I assigned the sounds to the volume. Now, how you set up the macros and what you assign to the macros is kind of going to be, you know, how you're shaping your sound and what you'd like to have control of in real time. There is no real wrong way or right way to set that up. It's all personal preference and to how you'd like to, you know, work with your music. What I have is I have on macro 1, I have assigned to a filter on the kick drum. You're probably going to want to put some headphones on for this so that you can actually hear what's going on. I'm going to launch this scene, and then I'll show you. When I turn this knob all the way up, it removes the low end from the kick drum, and it gives us this sort of vibe of chilling, and then I can drop that back in. 2, 3, and follow? So that's one adjustment that I assigned there. And how I do something like that, right, is I, you know, find our kick drum. In this case, I've done this exact same thing 3 times because I have 3 different kick drums. And what I've done is I've put a high pass filter, you know, using Beatmaker 3 on the kick drum. And on the cutoff here, I'll double tap that. And in this case, it says unbind macro, but it's because I've already bound it to a macro. But here it would give you the opportunity to, you know, bind that knob to any macro you want. Let me show you what I mean by clicking something that doesn't have something assigned to it. Let's say I want to assign this knob, this hold knob, to a macro so I can tweak that in real time. You just double tap this. You click where it says macro controls, and it's going to give you the option of any of your 16 macros here, which you can also label as you're setting them up. And I, again, really recommend labeling as you go, because this is some pretty deep stuff, guys, and you're probably going to want to label as you go so you can keep track of what you're actually doing. But once you've done that, once you've, you know, assigned a knob to a macro, you know, double tapped and assigned it to whichever macro you want. In this case, again, we've assigned the cutoff of the high pass filter to this macro here. Then you can just click over on the macros button inside of Beatmaker 3. And here we have macros 1 through 8. If I click here, it's macros 9 through 16. In this case, I assigned this to macro 1. So now each of these, you know, macro knobs on Beatmaker 3 has 3 little dots next to it. If I click those, it opens up a window where any knob that I have assigned to that macro in Beatmaker 3 shows up here, and it lets me tell Beatmaker 3 exactly how I want it to respond when I move this knob. In this case, I have at its minimum state, meaning, you know, the knob is all the way down. At its minimum state, I have the filter set to just 16 hertz. We're not removing any lows at all, really. But then when I turn this filter up on all three of our kick drum pads, there's a, you know, same thing, high pass filter, and it turns that filter up to 283 hertz, essentially removing any low frequencies below 283 hertz. You can see on the screen that Beatmaker 3 is moving that filter as I move this knob here. So this is really up to you. What knobs inside of, you know, your sampler do you want to assign to these macros? The reason why I'm using this one bank workflow, guys, is because, you know, if I have a bass on one channel, on one track, and the kick on another track, like when I want to affect this kick drum here, if I have the bass track selected and I move this knob, it's not going to affect that. It has to be the bank you've selected only of what's going to affect the macros. So I just use one bank, guys. It's always selected. You follow? If I want to use virtual instruments and AU synths and whatnot, load them on a different channel, program some stuff that you want them to do, and then render that out to an audio loop or a sample, one shot, you know, render that out right in Beatmaker 3 and re-import that sample. Go to your, you know, wherever you're storing your samples up here, you know, go to your, you know, samples or imports or whatever, and then just start dragging them to the pads. You don't need to keep that synth in real time. You'll save a little bit of CPU, most likely, when you render stuff to audio. And then you can just keep dragging it onto the pads and work in a one-bank workflow. Now say you want to do some EQ work, you know, and say, you know, you want to like take out the lows on maybe something like a ride sound so that there's no, you know, hidden low rumble gremlins and it sound like this. That's not a problem. You can do individual effects on every single pad here, as many as you know, have CPU for inside of your iPad. In this case, if I want to affect the ride, I can just click the effects tab here, and then I can click where it says bank 1. And I can click select pad, and here I have the option to select any of the pads in, you know, our bank 1 here. Again, I really suggest, you know, labeling everything, because if you're labeling everything, it all shows up right here, and you can just pick what you'd like to, you know, put an effect on. In this case, let's choose this ride symbol, and you can see here I've got a 6-band EQ on this, and I've got it removing any frequencies below 650 hertz. If we scroll down a little bit more, you can see that I'm also side chaining ever so gently that ride to our kick drum sample, so that it helps our kick drum punch through the mix. If you need a little bit of help getting your brain around sidechain compression and why you might want to use that inside of Beatmaker 3, I have a video on that. I'll put a link to that. So yeah, guys, I mean, this is my workflow. It's loading individual sounds. You don't have to record them. They could be samples from your sample library. They could be samples from, you know, loop packs that you've downloaded from Electronisounds, no doubt. You know, and you just, you know, put the sounds on the pads as needed. Let's change to a different clip, and I'll show you guys how I have the effects routing set up in here and what reverb and delay I'm using in the mix. Okay, for the most part, I'm just using Beatmaker 3's internal effects on this jam, but I am using 3 third-party effects, and let me show you those now. If we go to our main out, you can see that I've put the Amazing Noises limiter on our master bus, so every single sound in the mix is running through this limiter, and this is making sure that we're not doing any clipping on the master bus. It's also giving me a tiny little bit of extra saturation on the full mix. I have this set to 0.33, so it's a very gentle amount of saturation, which is just, you know, basically bringing in a little tiny bit of harmonic distortion, which you can mess with to taste. I find, you know, a little bit goes a long way. I have the input gain up just a little bit, and I want to make sure that when the mix is going, watch your ears here, I'm going to pop this in. I want to make sure that we're not attenuating by, like, you know, 10, 20 decibels or whatever. I find that if we're attenuating about -5 decibels or less, that's really good, you know, and where you want to be. And you can assign your volumes on your, you know, individual samples so that you're not, you know, sending too much level to the master bus. So the reason you might want to put a limiter on your master bus, guys, is so that you, as you're producing, you don't have any rogue signals that might, be way too loud unexpectedly, and that could maybe damage your, earphones. That could maybe damage your ears. That could maybe damage your speakers. Putting a limiter on the master bus is something I always recommend. I actually have a video on just putting a limiter on the master bus in Beatmaker 3. I'll put a link to that up in the corner. And let's see here. The other two non-factory effects that I'm using are, if we go to effects aux 1, I'm using the Dub Station 2 from Audio Damage, and this is my go-to delay plugin for iPad. And then over on Auxiliary 2, I'm using the EOS 2 Reverb plugin from Audio Damage, and this is my go-to reverb effect for iPad as well. And I've got these set up through the auxiliary sends so that I'm not using like an instance of reverb on every single channel or something, because that will, max out your CPU faster than anything else, extra instances of reverb. So we only have one third-party reverb and one third-party delay in our mix. If we're looking at our mixer here, it looks pretty small, and you're thinking, Dean, how could you, mix all this, different sounds together and get control over what you want to send to the effects? It's super limited. It's really not, though. You can just double click on the bank tab itself, X that out, and then you got control over every single individual pad in that bank. And you can adjust the volumes here if you want to. I don't typically do that. I typically just leave these at 0 and adjust them individually. You can adjust the panning of every single pad here, and importantly, you can adjust the send on every single pad individually. So like if you want to add a clap and you want to have a lot of reverb and delay just on that clap, let's see here, which I've definitely done here. Here's the MC303 clap, and I've got it, send to delay and 1 and 2. Whereas if you scroll over here, you'll see that I'm not sending the kick samples to the effect. You can set all this kind of stuff up in here. And if you want to be able to tweak in real time your effects and stuff, you can double click on any of these knobs. You can click on macro controls, and you can assign that knob to any of the 16 macros as well, so that you can tweak that in real time. And I've done stuff like that as well. Excuse me. For instance, if I solo my claps here, and if I press this, cool. I've assigned the clap to this knob here, except not that clap, it's the other clap. That's great. Only one of these claps is assigned that way. So let me see which one it is. I think it's this one. Oh, I have it on solo. Yeah. Nope, it's still this one. Yeah. So what I did here, guys, is like, this is my main clap throughout the track, okay? But I wanted to be able to, in real time, turn a knob and have this get sent to much more delay and reverb. So over here, on fader number 4, I have the volume of all 3 claps assigned. If I bring that down, you'll see that you don't hear the claps anymore, okay? And how I do that, so we're going to go to the actual sound, and in the gain section, we'll double tap that, and instead of unbind macro, it'll say, assign to a macro, and you'll assign that to whatever macro you want. In this case, I've assigned 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 to these knobs, and then 9 through 16 of the macros to these faders, okay? Beatmaker 3 doesn't really know if you're moving a knob or a fader, you see, so you can assign either to the macros in Beatmaker 3. And so I've just, assigned it to this macro, and then I label this macro clap volume, right? I go into the 3 dots, rename macro, clap volume, and now I know what it is. Here's my 3 clap samples that are assigned here, and I tell it at the minimum state, meaning, when that fader is all the way down, these should be at negative infinity. And then when I bring it up, you set the volume wherever you want the volume to be. I have a little bit different level on each of the claps. And this is how I do the actual level mixing inside of Beatmaker 3 when I'm using this technique. Is you'll assign, let me show you the kick drum here, for instance. Right? And then, I'll double tap the gain, right? And I'll assign that to whichever macro I want. In this case, it's macro number 9 I have assigned to this fader here. And I'll, I'll just open up macro number 9 with the dots. I'll rename this to kicks volume because that's what it is. And I've assigned all 3 pads there. I just tell it, at the minimum volume, that should be all the way down, -0. And at the maximum volume, it should be whatever volume I want these kicks to be. In this case, it was 1.1 decibel. So this effectively gives us, volume on all of the samples. But you have to assign every sample to a fader individually. And then you'll need to go into that assignment and you'll need to set the minimum volume to 0 and the maximum volume to wherever you want that sound to be in the mix when you bring the fader up. I hope that makes sense, guys. Let's see what else we can, figure out today. Let's go back over to my macros 1 through 8 page and I'll show you exactly what I've done here. On the macro 1, I've assigned, that kick high pass filter. Basically what I tried to do was on every track, I tried to put a knob above it that would do something to that track. So the knob above the kick track affects the kick's high pass filter. The knob above this tom bassline sample will filter that down. Let's see if I can show you what that sounds like as well. If I solo these, right? Fantastic. So you can hear that I've got a filter assigned to that. And I can, bring that out of the mix anytime I want because I've assigned, that volume to this macro, which essentially is, a fader. Macro 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Macro 9, 10, 11, 12. You follow? So I would go gain, assigned to macro 10. And then I would go to macro 10, which I've labeled tom bass volume. I set it so the minimum state is 0 and the maximum state is whatever I want this to be in the mix, Then I assign that filter, assign it to the macro above the knob so that it makes sense with what's there. Okay, and then let's see here, back to the first macros over here. Let's see here, I've got a hi-hats track on, this one here, which I can see if I can unsolo these. If we solo my hats here, but you can't hear it because the volume's down, the fader's down. See? Super cool. So this is really important, and this is how, you can set up your live jams with Beatmaker 3 so that at any time, even though it's playing a part, that you can adjust stuff in real time. So if I move the macro, which is above this, it's going to do something to that, sound. In this case, it does a little bit of a filter down, and then if it's another scene, in a different scene, I have it playing a different hat, and when I, filter that down, it adds a little bit of delay to the hat. Over here, we have, the clap, which when I can bring the clap up or down in the mix at any time with the fader, and I can send the clap to more delay and more reverb by turning this macro above the clap. Over here, we have another tom, and this was a really important element of my mix, you guys. I'll solo this and see if I can't go into the scene with it playing. Cool. So what I did was I assigned on the tom, I assigned its pitch to a macro here, so I can, put this anywhere in between. No tom on that scene. Here we go. So anytime during the mix, I can, bring the volume of this out because I've assigned it to, again, 1 through 8, so 9, 10, 11, 12 would be macro 13, right? If you go to macro 13, you'll see it's labeled tom's volume. All the way down is set to -infinity. And when I bring it up, it's like -7 decibels. And so with that knob above it, I have a control over that tuning. And you just set that up. All you have to do is, go into the pad. We'll unsolo these, right? We'll go into the pad, and there's, fine tune and tune. I used regular tune, and I just double click that. Instead of, saying unbind, it'll say assign to a macro. You'll pick whichever macro you want. I just counted over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to get it where I want it. Assign it to the knob above the fader I have it assigned to. Next over, I have the ride, and I did that pitch trick again with my ride so that I could, mess with the tuning of the rides in real time throughout the track. And so let me see if I can play that. If I go into scene mode, and I have a scene here called add ride. Now I can bring the volume up or down at any time. This is only because we're in one bank, guys. I can't stress this enough. I'm not having to switch back and forth between banks ever because there's only one bank. That's how I'm doing this. So there's our volume, and at any time I can change the tuning on that and really change the vibe of what I'm doing. You know, in real time, no matter what scene is playing, I've got control over all the volumes and a little bit of effects on top of those as well. Over here on this track 7, I have the bass that I sampled out of the Virus. I didn't actually end up really doing much with this. I think it's the only macro in the mix that I left blank. And then lastly, over here on track 8, fader, which is macro 16, I've assigned the volume to all of my melodic sounds in the mix. So all of my chord samples and stuff. Whoops, I'm soloing. I don't want to be. Right? I can just bring those down at any time in the mix. And I can also, I've gone in to each pad, right? You go into each pad, and I've assigned a low-pass filter. Low-pass filter. And this one was the band pass filter, right? But I've assigned that filter to this macro here so that at any time during our mix I can tweak what the melodics are doing and change the vibe of the track from a fully open filter to a more closed down and eliminate those high frequencies and give it a more chilled vibe for just a moment. Maybe even drop the volume down. When I pull the volume down, I could maybe like bring this back to normal and then boom, drop that back in whenever we want to, kind of thing. Using this filter stuff in real time also, you might have just heard it there. Every now and again that will do a little bit of cracking as well. Like you can kind of hear it every now and again. I think that would be less if I had a more powerful iPad. I don't have any plans to get a more powerful iPad at this time. Who knows what the future will hold, but so basically that's the concept, guys, is that I put this into scene mode, right? It's just a bunch of one-shots is all it is. I can affect the one-shots any way I want by going to the effects tab, clicking up here, clicking whatever pad I want. Everything's labeled. It's easy to find. I can put effects on anything I want, right? No problem. If I want to get detailed with the mix, we can, look at our mixer and double click that bank tab and close that out. We have individual control over all of our sounds still. So I really don't see this mode as all that big of a hindrance per se. The only real thing you can't do is you can't have a whole bunch of instruments like synthesizers and stuff in here in real time and still use this workflow. But what you can do is load any synthesizers you want and get the parts set you want on a whole track in a different way, render anything you need from a synth to audio, and then just drag it onto the pads. You can just keep going up, just keep dragging stuff onto the pads until your iPad won't handle it anymore. So if you have one of the newer iPads, you can probably get away with a lot more sounds and a lot more effects than what I was able to do. I put EQ just about on every single pad. So we're definitely, pushing a lot of stuff here. You saw that I've got a lot of stuff routed and all the macros assigned and whatnot. Let's see here. If I go over to the gears page, our CPU just sitting still is bouncing up to about 42% because of all the stuff I've got set up in here and whatnot. I hope I've done an okay job at kind of explaining why I use this workflow and how to use this workflow. If you guys have questions, please put those in the comments section and I will do my best to answer them. I hope you guys have found this useful and, found maybe yet another way that you can use Beatmaker 3. Thanks for watching, guys. Until next time.